Hello and welcome back to the Nutrition and Life podcast. My name is Lisa, I'm your host, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with nutrition coach Jordan Lips. Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
I'm super excited to talk to you about all kinds of things in regards to training and, of course, fat loss today. But I would just love to hear a little bit about yourself before we get into those things. So, if you would like to share with us how you got to where you are today in terms of business, but also personally.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep it short. I didn't intend on doing this. I had other plans for my life. But I wanted to take a break from those plans and do some in-person personal training. I had a local gym that was close to my heart, just a local place, more of a boutique place, not a big box gym, more of a mom and pop personal training studio, and immediately fell in love with it. I was just like a typical like meathead, like just training myself and figured, oh yeah, I could do this for other people. But um, just really enjoyed being with people and giving people a safe and enjoyable place to come and exercise, a reason to come back. Loved the social side of it and really just fell in love with it. And, life plans changed at that moment. And so, spent a long time in the in-person game, opened my own gym, did that for a bit and realized that wasn't really it for me. I didn't really love opening a gym. It took me away from working with people. And so, just a little bit prior to COVID, moved most of my stuff online and have been there ever since, working with people one-on-one. And also I have a group training program. So I really do enjoy the online space. I really enjoy working one-on-one with people. And that has been a really just nice shift, from what I was planning on doing in life, which is becoming a lawyer, which maybe would have been fun, but this is way better.
Well, I and I'm sure many of your followers love that you have chosen this path. And yeah, I see on your t-shirt as well the name of your group training program, WUMP. So hopefully later you can give us a little bit more details about that as well.
Cool.
But yeah, in terms of what you share with the world that's online based. I'm happy for you that you were online already before COVID. I'm sure it just made things a lot easier that you were already sort of settled into it when that hit. And same for me, I started in 2019. So I guess like literally a year before COVID hit. And I was super fortunate to already be going full time by the time that that came along. I bet you felt the same way. But yeah, I can only encourage everybody to check out Jordan Lips Fitness on Instagram because you put out some really valuable content on there. And one of the things you spoke about recently was in regards to machine versus free weights. And I wanted to dig into that because there's a lot of debates out there and about both of them, which one is better, when should we do which, and maybe you can share with us your opinion on that.
Yeah, I hope I don't uh, go opposite to what I said in that post. But I think that for starters, there's probably more made of this discussion than there should be. I think that they're both incredible. They can be both can and should be part of a resistance training routine for basically any goal outside of like if you're a I mean, even if you're a power lifter, Olympic weightlifter, where you're like have obligate exercises that you absolutely have to do and compete in that are barbell oriented, like those athletes are still going to use machines when they need a bit more stability as well. When it comes to building muscle, though, building muscle is a stimulus sport. It's not a skill. What I mean is that you don't. What we need to do is maximize the stimulus at like the fiber level. We don't necessarily need to be incredibly skilled with complex movements like you might need to do if you're an Olympic weightlifter or a little bit less so as a power lifter. We're just trying to get as much stimulus at the muscle level, at the fiber level as possible. And the more stable you can be, the more you can challenge the target muscle without making other shit tired at the same time. And so, if you have the opportunity to use a chest support for rows, your lower back and your core can do a little bit less work, and that will reduce the amount of fatigue that you take on for that movement. And the actual target muscles that you're trying to work are the ones getting taxed and nothing else. And so when it comes to hypertrophy, we're trying to get as much stimulus as we can with as little fatigue as we can. Quite often, machines, cables give us an opportunity they provide the stability for us such that we don't need to create it ourselves. And creating that stability ourselves might look like if you're doing a barbell row, you have to hold that bent over hinged position. Your glutes, your hams, your lower back are working just to get you into the position to do the row. Where again, same example, if you do a chest support, None of those things have to work. You can just focus on the pulling motion. So I think in many ways, I would take a really, really good machine. So if you're going to let me monologue here, I would take a perfect machine that fits your structure, that fits what you're trying to do over free weights any day. The problem is we're not all built the same, and machines aren't all built incredibly well. And so the benefit of free weights is that you can use more customizable arm paths. You can use more customizable positions that might better fit your structure. You might have a rowing machine that has, handles that only are way too wide for you or for the goal that you're looking to do. Or you might be in a linear hack squat, which is like a seated hack squat, which basically is a cool machine in theory, but if you're under 6 feet, it just rarely has the type of range of motion that you would need. So machines aren't always great and they don't always fit our structure. And so free weights and cables are really nice because they let us customize arm path and movement, arm path, leg path, and movement. But if you gave me a perfect machine for somebody's structure and the goal they have, chances are that addition of extra stability is going to increase output at the target muscle. And so, yeah, there's going to be circumstances where something like a leg press probably, again, in at least a theoretical level, is better than a back squat for leg development because it's not as technical. You don't need to, the technique is much easier to execute. And you don't need to worry basically at all about your core and your lower back. And so the output, at the actual muscles you're trying to work is going to be higher.
Absolutely. I love how you framed that. And from personal experience, I can only attest to that. I have to say that I've come from a background of CrossFit, and free weights is everything, and barbells over everything, and compounds for sure. Everyone needs to be doing compounds. And then I transitioned a little bit more into the a wannabe bodybuilding sort of space and learned like, oh, whoa, Elisa, you never knew how to activate your glutes. That's probably why you've had sciatic nerve issues. Oh, whoa, you never knew how to activate your lats. That's probably why you've had elbow issues as well. And so those machines have helped me so much do exactly that, reconnect to the specific muscle groups, and also, as you mentioned, lower that systemic type of fatigue as well. And to your point of not every machine fits everybody, even now, when I use a pull down machine at the gym here, there are a few of the pull down machines where I'm like not feeling my lat at all, and I'm pulling more with my rhomboids, and I'm like, nope, this is just reinforcing a negative movement pattern. Whereas others, or perhaps the cable pull down, I'm like, oh, okay, I can feel it now. I can tweak into that position. So I love how you kind of like contrasted those two. And so many of the people listening are gonna say, well, I want to be stronger and I want to get more hypertrophy, or want to get a gain in muscle mass. So in general, when it comes to programming, what do we have to look out for between one and the other? Let's just say if we want to just target hypertrophy, if we want to just target strength, or if we want a bit of both.
Yeah, I think I have a bit of a not with you, but I think when someone asks that question, I first usually will reply with, what do you mean by strength? Because someone's like, oh, I want to, like let's say you take my program, is in air quotes geared towards hypertrophy. And someone's like, oh, that must mean you use a lot of machines. It's like that actually is no part to play in whether or not I'm trying to get stronger or build muscle. The differences between strength training and hypertrophy training aren't implement based. And so I'm only saying that because a lot of times what people do mean is they mean like stronger at barbell squatting, or stronger at barbell benching. They don't mean general strength. They mean specific strength at a specific barbell movement. It's like, okay, that's a slightly different question. I think the differences between strength and hypertrophy training aren't really implement based at all. I mean, you get stronger at what you do. And so if we're doing a lot of machines, you get stronger at those movements and doing those movements with more weight. And so you're going to get stronger at whatever you do. So it's not necessarily an implement question. I don't know if you want to go into the difference between training for those two, but when it comes to the question of free weights and machines, if it's a strength training program, like it might be a lot of machines. If it's a hypertrophy program, it could still have a lot of free weights. The differences between those two trainings would be less about implements and more about some other training variables.
So more in regards to rep ranges, rest time, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think very Simply put, I mean, if your goal is strength, on average, you'll train with more weight, less reps, more rest, less volume, maybe even more frequency, depending on the skill development portion of it. And with hypertrophy, again, on average, you'll probably use, more moderate loads, moderate rep ranges, variable rest periods, a little bit more volume, and a little bit closer to failure. The strength that you can stay a little further from failure and gain strength. So those would be the big differences I would see.
Okay, awesome. No, that kind of explains your position on those, and I'm totally aligned with both of that. I think that's often kind of like, oh, what's the hypertrophy range, quote unquote, what's the strength range, and so on. But yeah, as you kind of started off with, in the end, especially in terms of hypertrophy, comes down to time under tension and how we create that, right? Is sort of wonderfully up to us. A lot of people they're like, oh no, give us like a more concise answer, but actually it's wonderful that we have so much room to play there. One
Yes.
other thing I saw on your profile was a post about favorite glute exercises. And of course, as someone who has transitioned more into like the bodybuilding type space, I like to train like a bikini competitor without stepping on stage. And therefore, glutes is one of my focus areas. And I'd love to hear what exercises you like to use in that regard.
Yeah, what we would be looking for an exercise that would be good for the glutes, um, in my opinion, be threefold. Would be something that challenges the glutes and exposes the glutes to a long muscle length. So something where your glutes are being stretched, and then an exercise where when your glutes are stretched, there's actually some good tension there. So we have exposure to a long muscle length, we have tension at a long muscle length, and then we have stability, like we talked about previously. And then we have, I would say, ease of execution. So just how complicated is this technique? And that usually kind of goes hand in hand with stability. The more stability you have, usually the easier the technique is, but doesn't necessarily always track 100%. And so we're looking for an exercise where you get the glutes stretched, where you challenge them where they're stretched, where the technique's pretty easy, and where there's a lot of stability and not a whole lot of other muscles working incredibly hard at the same time. So we're looking at things like hinges, like leg presses, like RDLs. Sorry, hinges, like RDLs, like good mornings. Lower body pressing movements that don't emphasize too much knee bend. So things like split squats, lunges, leg presses, step ups. Um, and then we have our hip extension movements. So we have the 45-degree hip extension, we have a glute bridge, we have a hip thrust. Um, then we have things that train more of that abduction-y movement. So we have more of like a kick to the leg, kick to the side sort of stuff. Um, and I would put glute med work in there as well. Glute med kickbacks, standing abduction, seated abduction, stuff like that. And so hinges, I would call them squatting patterns. So lunges, leg presses, split squats, and then hip extension patterns. Hip extension, even though these aren't technically biomechanically appropriate names for stuff, but hip extension-y stuff, hinges, squat patterns, and then abduction-y stuff. What I would say on this is that when we look at the hip extension stuff, so the hip 45-degree hip extension and a glute bridge or a hip thrust, they don't challenge the glutes much in a short position. They don't expose the glutes to a very short, a lengthened position. They don't expose the glutes to a very long muscle length, and they're not hard where the glutes are stretched within that range of motion. However, the big upside of hip thrust, glute bridge, and then a really well done 45-degree hip extension is that they're more isolated to the glutes. And so what they lack in terms of like lengthened overload or lengthened challenge, they make up for the fact that it's an exercise that's less likely to reach failure for any other reason than your glutes are hurting. So when, I made that post quite a while back. I probably ranked glute leg press as the top exercise, because of the stability, because of the long muscle length, because there's basically no technique at all. Like it's incredibly easy to execute. But you will find people that say, no matter what I do, I put my feet high, I put my feet narrow, I got my toes pointed forward, I'm driving through my heels, don't have too much knee flexion. Jordan, I'm getting a net quad stimulus. Like I feel it in my glutes, but the thing that gets me to failure is my quads tell me I have to stop. And so conceptually, we might be like, oh yeah, glute leg press, best exercise. But for that person might need exercises that take the quads out of it a little bit more. And for that person, maybe more hinging and a little bit more glute bridge, hip thrust, hip extension. And so I think that there's a little bit of individuality here. I run a group with a lot of people. And so these sorts of problems come up a lot where I'll program a glute leg press and I'll have a lot of people, I'm feeling this in my quads. We look at their form video. It looks great. And for that type of a person, we might bump up the importance of something like a hip thrust or a glute bridge or a kickback, stuff that makes the glutes basically the only solution to the problem of moving the weight and helps us isolate the glutes a little bit more. So glute bridge, hip thrusts are kind of getting kind of shit on right now because we're in this like lengthened partials, lengthened position. This is like, that's the age we're in right now. And I agree. I think the glutes certainly grow better with lengthened position work, but the benefit of being able to isolate the glutes, albeit in the short position, is at least an upside that's worth noting.
Awesome. And just to clarify, when you say glute focused leg press, what can the listeners focus on in order to get the emphasis more on the glute in terms of positioning of the feet, etc.?
Yeah. So very generally speaking, you can think of the leg press if you close your eyes and you imagine a square. The higher you go on the square, the less quads you'll use and the more glutes you'll use. The lower you go on the square, the more quads you'll use, the less glutes you'll use. And the wider you go on the square, the more adductors you'll use, the less glutes you might use, depending on who you ask. But you can have several permutations of combinations, right? You could be high and wide and you can get some adductor and glute. You could be low and wide for adductor and quad. You can be low with feet together for more quad, less adductor. You can be high and close together for more glute. And that being the answer to your question, where if you were going to articulate in one sentence what a glute dominant leg press looks like, it's feet high on the platform and feet about hip width with the toes pointing basically straight forward, maybe a tiny bit of external rotation. And if you were to take a form video from the side, what you would notice is at the bottom of the rep where you feel like you've run out of range of motion, you'll have something like 90 degrees of knee flexion. Again, something like that. Doesn't always need to be perfect. And that just means if you snap a picture and you look at the angle of where your shin meets, your femur meets your tibia, that you have a 90-degree angle there. And that just represents the quads not working that much. And so if the quads aren't working that much, we've left the glutes to do a lot more work.
Awesome. Thank you. And what is your stance on the whole debate of what's better for glute gains, hip thrusts or squats? Because there's been a lot of debates and even studies, and Brett Contreras and so on have been like discussing this for several years probably by now, but I'm interested to hear your stance.
Yeah, I think that it's what I would say is if somebody can do a really good glute dominant squat, either they can do a good glute dominant squat or because of their anthropometrics, just their limb length, that they are basically a hip dominant squatter, then I think it's going to be the squat is bar none way better for glute gains. But in my group program, I've programmed glute dominant squats before, and I just see a very wide range of execution, what it looks like for people. And for a lot of people, the obsession with trying to make the squat very glute biased by pushing the hips back a ton, limiting, knee translation forward over the toe. The weight that they can move goes down so much because they're nitpicking their technique so much. So I think the answer is squats, period. However, if you are someone who, if you were a bikini competitor, let's say, and you were going at this with the level of intent of like, well, I want something that grows my glutes and doesn't grow my quads as much. Not because not because growing your quads is bad for a bikini competitor, but maybe that's just something that this person would have to work on. You might say, well, the squat gives me a bit too much quad stimulus. I might favor more of a glute bridge hip thrust. And what's cool is this either or question is mostly theoretical because you have a full program of exercises. You don't just have one exercise, but I think they both should be in your program. I think that the study with the squat and the hip thrust was fine and theoretical, but I do think every program that's ever been designed to grow glutes has had both and should have both. Personally, my current position is I try with a barbell back squat. Listen, for hypertrophy, we don't really do that much technically demanding stuff. We like the most technical movement we do is a barbell back squat. It's the hardest thing to teach. we're not Olympic weightlifters where these are highly technical lifts. We're not, golfers. We're not, what we do doesn't have a big technique demand, except the barbell back squat, I think does. And so I have found more success with helping people find a technique, barbell squatting technique that feels really intuitive for them, that feels strong, that allows them to achieve good amounts of depth. Um, and kind of letting bias fall where it may to some degree, not forcing people with really long femurs to use a barbell back squat for their quads. Maybe leaning into somebody with really short femurs to doing a barbell back squat for their quads. And so I know that wasn't where you were coming from with your question, but I tend to find that the barbell back squat isn't my preferred place to really stress bias. It's usually the place I would rather somebody get under the bar, find a foot position, a width of their feet, a level of external rotation, and an execution pattern, whether that's with wedges and more knees forward, or it's on a flat foot with more hips back, or on wedges with more hips back, that they feel really good and strong. And I might create the bias with other movements such that the program reflects what we want.
What I love about your answer is that you, number one, include squats regardless of like it being not necessarily the focus for glute gains, but simply sound more like for the purpose of let's make sure we're going through that movement pattern, even just for longevity, for functionality, and also so that you feel strong with everything. But in general, I think going back to the study that you mentioned, I do think that they measured depth, but I don't think that there was any standardization when it came to width or anything like that. So truly, I mean, how much of a transfer truly is there? Like we can always discuss that, but nonetheless, I really liked your answer. And so yeah, maybe at this point you can share a bit more about your group program. What's the setup of it? Like how many days a week do people train? Is it like a quarterly intake or can people join whenever?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's a hypertrophy based group with the focus of building muscle. And it's certainly not, you don't need to be very advanced to do it. We like to keep it simple. It is on the lower volume end. I'm an efficiency nut. I mean, if I can find any tool, the reason I love hypertrophy training and hypertrophy research and following with what's current and how to get the best gains is not because I'm personally interested in getting the most gains. I'm personally interested in doing the least and getting pretty good results. And so, they're kind of two very similar pursuits because I care about what gets the most gains, but I care about it so that I can do less. And so the program is moderate to low volume, but on the higher intensity side, quality, execution. Anyway, you can train 3 or 4 days a week. You can be at home or in the gym. Workouts 45 to 60 minutes. It's not earth-shattering programming, but it's definitely made by somebody who's giving enough of a shit to make sure that it's good enough.
I love that. And I mean, that's gonna hit the majority of people, right? Like the majority of people just want to have a healthy life, do that for somewhat of an aesthetic look, but not necessarily with a super high focus on I want to look the best that I can. They probably have a few kids to juggle. They have all sorts of other things. And so speaking of doing minimal effort, that brings me to another topic that I wanted to ask you about, and that's a post that you made on, do you really need to count all three macros? So kind of shifting a little bit more into the nutrition space here. But yeah, I mean, some people say, can I just count calories? Do I need to count all three macros? If all three macros, we can get as nitpicky as, do we need to worry about net carbs and blah, blah, all that sort of difference? What's your stance on this?
Yeah, there's just 99% of the time we'll go over what the 1% exceptions are, but 99% of the time changes in body composition come down to calories and protein. If we equate for calories and protein, the ratio of carb to fat just does not matter. The times it might matter are for when, if left to one's own devices, somebody would eat incredibly low of a certain macro. So if people are like really afraid of carbs, I might have a client intentionally track their carbs as a way of making sure they get enough. If someone's an endurance athlete, you might say, okay, I want to track my carbohydrates, so I make sure I'm getting enough. the irony is, even for that person, I think intuitively endurance athletes can get enough carbohydrates. Just making sure each plate of food has a carbohydrate source is probably good enough for 99% of the population. So it's incredibly rare I will have a client track all three macros, maybe as part of an education process of learning what's in foods. But rarely will we have specific targets. So there's a difference between tracking all three macros and having really rigorous, meticulous targets for all three macros. We might track all three macros out of interest. Where are your carbs and fats falling on average? Just make sure we get enough essential fats. Maybe make sure we're not on the flip side going full blown keto if that's not something you want to do. But rarely will I give a client specific to the gram targets for all three macros.
Yeah, that I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it can take off so much pressure of the client themselves, because that just at the end of the day you might end up being doing like macro Tetris and eating, literally. I will say that that is literally a mistake I made in the early years of tracking in 2016. I had a tablespoon of olive oil sometimes because I was like, oh my God, I'm so short on my fat macros. I need to eat my olive oil. Or then other times like having this dry as rice cracker with nothing because I needed some carbs. And so I will say that personally, I've probably for the last 3, 4, maybe even longer, 4 years, I have just kind of stuck with calories, protein, and as you mentioned, like a rough idea of where my carbs and fats are, because particularly when it comes to fats, I don't know about you, but have worked with a few clients that come from a lower fat sort of background, and they're scraping with like 35, 38, 39 grams of fats daily, and we're starting to see those hormonal issues. So that's not ideal either, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I've experienced that as well. People coming to me again with previously held beliefs around carbs or fats. And maybe by just tracking calories and protein, we can break those beliefs and move into a place of understanding. I'd rather you track calories, protein, focus on foods you enjoy and can sustain, and then maybe track all. Sorry about
Yeah,
that. Dogs are going crazy. Yeah,
that
I'd rather people focus on calories, protein, and filling up those calories and protein with foods they enjoy. And I will tell people, hey, if you want to put all three of them in the sheet, we'll take a peek and see if you're doing something where we need to intervene and be more intentional. But that has legitimately never happened in my coaching career where I'm like, oh, you're at 15 grams of fat per day. We really need to go, be very intentional with that. I'm sure that has happened. It just hasn't happened to me, let's say.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'll sometimes say to clients, or if they have like extreme weight fluctuations and or even digestive fluctuations, let's put it that way, then I might take a look at their food log and be like, okay, well, this one day you had like 45 grams of fiber, and the next day basically none. No wonder you're, constipated or struggling with that, or that it's affecting weight and water retention in that regard sometimes also.
Yep, definitely
Um,
a thing to factor in.
But yeah, I mean, I love how you're trying to like simplify everything for people. And a few things that will stand out when people check out your Instagram, hopefully, is also you speak about certain quote unquote myths that might be out there. I think that I saw you commenting on someone going into the details of like various types of sugar and how that's important. Yeah, maybe not, it doesn't have to be on that topic, but like just in general, this kind of niche sort of thing. What's your opinion on that, or what do you want the listeners to take away from this?
Yeah, I just think that there's an epidemic of majoring in the minors. I think that it's not even, I don't even necessarily wage war on specific myths. The implication of a myth being that it's false. The bigger myth is the importance of X thing. A lot of people talk about things. One of the biggest problems I think with social media is not that the things that people are saying are untrue. By the way, there is totally scenarios where that is the case, and I will wage war against that as well. But what I wish was also there was, hey, here's this piece of information that I'm sharing, and I'm going to file it in the hierarchy of importance where I think it should go, instead of like, this is a truth, period. It's like, yeah, this is a truth, and it matters exactly this much compared to all the other shit you have to worry about. I think that second part is missing. And the reason it's missing is because on purpose, if I told you if I told you, everyone's talking about fucking getting rid of the food dye in Fruit Loops. It's like if if we had an open and honest discussion about how important that is, then your videos wouldn't get as many views, it wouldn't get as many shares, you wouldn't be as popular. So people don't actually want you to know how unimportant some of this stuff is. And so they can hide behind mechanistic truths while at the same time not giving you the whole picture of how important it is what they are saying. And so I try and do this in my content. So if somebody's going to, be like, hey, you didn't do it this one time, I would look for people that also make that known of like, if we're going to talk about, the importance of getting enough protein in, I want somewhere in that post that to say, hey, but resistance training is by far more important. And so, cool, let's talk about protein. Let's talk about a target range. Here's some high protein foods. But like, if you're doing this to build muscle strength, improve bone density, quality of life, like the resistance training stimulus is way more important than fussing over, am I eating 0.5 grams per pound or 0.7 grams per pound? If you've never taken a set anywhere near failure, I don't want to hear about it. So I think that that's something, we could talk about specific myths, but I want people to look for that sort of rhetoric in content. People telling you a thing, but also trying to paint a picture of where this piece of information should fall in the stuff you should care about.
I think that's a really great lens for people to use in the sense, like even just by the example of your sugar post thingy, like, okay, how does that fit in? Okay, well, sugar, right? Maybe we shouldn't just consume refined sugar, but where does that fit in within your carbs? Where does that fit in within your calories? And then within that, consistency still like, if you have one day where you're eating a lot of sugar, it's still not the end of the world. But if you have a ton of sugar, like 50% of your diet is sugar every single day, this is a different story. And I think that was the sort of like the red line in a positive manner. And going through your content, through your message, from what I could see from the outside, is like, number one, consistency with the few basic things, doing that correctly, and you will, don't have to worry about 80% of all the crap that's out there. Just keep doing what you're doing for the next, I don't know, however many years or until the end of your life, and you'll be better off than the majority of people. Is that sort of what is intended with your messaging?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that my focus is on big ROI habits and just reminding people that there's only so many things that they can focus on at a given time. There's just like a limited amount of cognition that you have to put forth towards your health and fitness. And I really want people to do the big ROI stuff. The thing is, I know, and I can tell from you and your content, just the way that we're talking right now, that you and I both have intellectual pursuits. Like we find joint angles and resistance profiles and all this stuff really fun, you know? And I think having an intellectual portion of this, whether it's nutrition or training, can make it more fun. But mostly for me and you, for the average person for whom this is not an intellectual pursuit, it is quite simple. It's all the basic, boring, healthy shit you already knew and already know and have always known you need to do. And so my hope is that I can remind people not to worry about the little stuff, reinforce the big ROI habits of, lifting weights a couple times a week, cardio a couple times a week, sleep, eat fruits and vegetables, protein, hug your parents, all this stuff. So yeah, that's really where my head's been at, and hopefully what I put out on social media.
Absolutely. I do think that comes across beautifully. And yeah, with all of those basics, in my opinion, the most important word is always consistency, because most people give up before they see success with the basics. And that's when they then think, I need this magic thing because what I've been doing hasn't worked. So I guess to sort of round this off, because I want to make sure I'm respecting your time, but particularly also with the people in your group, how do you quote unquote get them or keep them motivated? How do you keep them engaged when they're like, oh, Jordan, we've been doing this program for 6 weeks. I'm bored. I'm tired of this and that. I'm tired of eating protein. So how do you keep them going?
Yeah, the first thing is to make sure you're doing something you enjoy, and I think that's almost overstated. I think you have to do something you just don't really not like. And then you have to make sure you're not doing so much of it that you're starting to resent the time you spend there, where you would rather be somewhere else. So that only reinforces my approach from an efficiency standpoint of, People have said, "Hey, Jordan, can I add a fifth day? Are you gonna do a program that has a fifth day?" And I really believe, like, for a lot of people, that going from 3 to 4 days a week to like 5 or 6 days a week is where I think most people would start to resent the time spent on those extra days for the return on investment they're getting. But I think good programming, for the most part, like you said, is what is going to keep people engaged. And so you want to find the right balance of keeping things the same, right? And I think if you were to look at a spectrum of like a completely different program every month or the exact same program forever and ever and ever and ever, the best results probably happen closer to the keep shit the same side of the spectrum. But the name of the game is for you to train for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so at some point you're going to have to change something. So we want, just from a mental health enjoyment standpoint. So with a group training, the reason I really do enjoy the group training is it allows me to try and solve that problem on a larger scale. With my one-on-one clients, we'll sit down and we'll literally look at their program and go through each thing. Like, how's this feeling? How's this going? How's progression? How's your joints feel? But on a broader scale, it's about finding how much variation to implement to keep somebody intellectually engaged, emotionally engaged, enough novelty where there's something new and shiny, but enough consistency with what they're doing, because you and I know that keeping the exercises the same allows you to get really good at them. And when you get really good at them, not only does it decrease your workout time because you know how to set it up, you know what your warm-up weights are, you know what your working weights are, but you actually get more out of the movement. There's a reason that advanced lifters don't need more volume. It's because they are getting more stimulus per set than a beginner because they're better at the movements. And so we know that keeping shit the same is probably better for gains. But for the average person, novelty is important. So how do we find the least amount of novelty to keep people motivated and enjoying it? And yeah, I tend to say we keep somewhere between half and 2/3 of the program the same. And then we have somewhere between 50% and a third, 33% new stuff. But even new stuff doesn't need to be a whole new exercise. It could be a new rep range, a new rep scheme, an intensity technique, a superset, a pre-exhaust. And so, you can kind of like just dress it up differently, and you can keep people doing stuff that they're really good at while giving them enough novelty where they're like, okay, cool, like this is something different. And you get responses across the whole spectrum. You have people who want more new stuff. You have people who want less new stuff because they don't want to have to learn a whole bunch of new exercises. And I'm sympathetic to both of those. I tend to, for myself, keep more things the same because I'm um not an average person where I just go in and I enjoy the lifting. I don't necessarily need something new very often, but even me, I'll probably keep the same program for maybe more 95% the same for like 4 months, 4 to 6 months. And then I'll make some changes, but other people, and by the way, as long as you're training really hard, if you do it for 10, 15 years, like you're going to get super jacked unless you're doing something really wrong. So, if a little bit more variation is fun to you, I don't want you to feel like you're not going to make progress. You definitely need to make sure you're training hard. And I don't think what I'm saying is going from Zumba to Pilates to lifting to dance class. I mean, we're talking about swapping out a barbell row for a seated cable row, or, change of a rep range potentially, not, big swings in what you're doing per se.
Yeah, I like that you finished with that. And I think that's a really good point that there is, well, number one, personal variation, but still even along those lines, I think the people that initially at least ask for the most or more variety are those exactly coming from the various classes or from CrossFit or from Orange Theory or whatever, where they're just used to mixing things up. And once you kind of settle into, hey, the strength training thing is actually more of a quote unquote meditation for me. I'm supposed to be just focusing, like more focusing internally, as opposed to being entertained the whole time by what's going on around me. Once you accept that, I think it's easier for people to sort of settle into a particular program.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Jordan, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us. I will drop all your handles in the show notes, but why don't you shout out your Instagram or where people can find you in your program?
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. Always fun to chat. My Instagram is Jordan Lips Fitness. You can find everything there. I too have a podcast. I was stalking you a smidge, and I see that we have had many similar podcast guests and run in very similar circles. So if you're enjoying what's going on here, I'm sure that there will be a lot of similar topics covered. And yeah, you can find everything I do on Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you too. I appreciate it. Thanks, Lisa.